Welcome back to Passionate About Music Education, a channel dedicated to you, the music educator. My name is Rachel Hardman. Today we're going to talk about how to manage an unbalanced band. If you're lucky enough to work in a school where you have a concert band that has all the correct parts and the jazz band where you've got all the correct bodies on each part, then that's fantastic. But in reality, most of us find ourselves in a position where we inherit a band within the school, whether it's part of the band program or an extracurricular group that you do, that has unbalanced parts. And what I might mean is that you don't have your bassoon player or your French horn player. You might have 15 clarinets and one oboe, or you might have 15 alto saxes but no tenor and no baritone sax to balance out the parts. So how do we manage that, and how do we make that group sound amazing? I'm going to dive straight in and give you 10 top tips that you can consider on how to help your students, regardless of what instrument they play, be part of your school ensemble, your school band, and be successful. Tip number 1, never be afraid to simplify or adapt a part to suit your players. You might find yourself in a position where your brass section isn't as strong as your woodwind section. So you may find that you have to adapt the parts or simplify the parts for your trumpet section. Don't be afraid to do that, because the more you encourage your students to play, even if the parts are simplified, you take out those complicated rhythm patterns or big jumps or notes that they can't yet play, then you are making it easier for them to be successful and play the majority of the part. There's nothing worse as a beginner having a part where you maybe can only actually play about 5 or 6 notes out of the whole piece. If you get demoralized and you think, oh, I'm not good enough to be in band. So by you taking that time, and it is a lot of work, I totally understand that. And that's why using music software like Finale or Sibelius to simplify those parts works really well. Other great thing about using Sibelius is you can actually not only print out the part, you can send it to the student, you can pull out the audio so they can practice at home. I tend to only adapt and simplify parts for maybe 1 or 2 players in the band, somebody who new who's joined it. If I find that the music is too hard for my students, then I really am trying to look for those flexible ensembles. So when I've been teaching beginner bands and I have an assortment of instruments, maybe not a traditional band, so I've got some woodwind, brass, string players, maybe some guitar players that I want to try and include in my group, then I look for flexible parts, flexible ensembles. The one thing you need to consider with flexible ensembles is often all the parts are equally balanced in terms of difficulty, and that might not be the case with the group you have. You might have an amazing flautist, but everybody else is still that very beginner stage. So you do have to check when you're buying flexible arrangements that they will work for the students that you have. However, there are becoming more and more flexible arrangements available, so really do dig into those before going straight to concert band music. My second tip is to give your beginner flute players the oboe part as opposed to the flute part. Particularly if you've got a concert band piece where it's only got piccolo and flute 1, it doesn't have that flute 2. Move your beginner players to cover the oboe part. Now normally I do this because I don't have an oboe player, but it also is a lower pitch range, so it's still generally playing sort of B, A, G, C and D, which are those beginner notes that our students tend to start learning. So as soon as you start to go up to those really high ledger lines, it's quite challenging for our very beginner students. So the oboe part works really well for the beginner flute player. For tip 3, consider giving your clarinet players some of the trumpet parts, particularly if you haven't got many trumpet players or you've only got 1. If you've got 6 or 7 clarinet players, you could put a few of those on the trumpet part. Now you can either put them in the section sat with the trumpets, so they are officially trumpet parts and covering that, or you again may want to adapt the music so that they have their own clarinet music plus any parts where, you know, maybe they've got 8 bars rest where the trumpet's got the tune and they can take over and also join in and give that support. Works really well because they're both transposing instruments in the same key. My next tip number 4, is if you are like me, you've been in many schools where you've run bands but you haven't had a French horn player. Those parts can often be covered by your alto saxophones. So again, like you maybe adapt the clarinets onto trumpets, you can also adapt your alto saxophones onto French horns. Obviously with that you will need to transpose the parts, so it takes a little time, but if you get very quick at Sibelius inputting it and then transposing it down, then that's a really great way of covering that part. My next tip is really on how do you include students who don't maybe fit into a traditional concert band setting, like for instance your string players. You might be in a school where maybe you only have 2 or 3 string players and you don't want them to not be in anything, but you haven't maybe got enough to run a string chamber group or an orchestra. I've experimented with both, where I've bought string orchestral music for a band to play, and then I've bought concert band music and the strings come and join, and that one tends to work better. Although you have to be aware that your string players are going to struggle playing in all those flat keys, but that's something that if you're aware of, you can help them thinking about their positioning. I tend to give my violinists, if they're sort of beginners, the oboe part, and then if they're more advanced and can play right up in those sort of third positions, then I'll give them the flute part, because that tends to work really well. Tip 6, if you're lucky enough to have a talented viola player, and then you could consider giving them a clarinet part, so you'll need to transpose it, or maybe an alto sax or a French horn part and adapt. You could actually even mix parts up so that they're constantly playing, but they're also covering different instruments. If you have any cellos or double bass players, it's really good to cover those missing bass parts, your bassoon, your tenor saxophone, maybe your baritone saxophone, your tuba. Really look at those parts. Often that they're actually just the same, just transposed. So look at any parts that might be adapted, covered, and give them to your talented cello players and your talented double bass players. Tip 7 is for our piano students, those really talented piano students who want to get involved in an ensemble, who may not be at that point where they can be in a band of their own. They might not be ready for accompanying the choir or accompanying soloists, and maybe not strong enough to play some of those really difficult duets and for hand piano. So how do we encourage them? How do we actually get them to that point where they can take over those roles, especially if they're super keen but they're still in the sort of middle school age? What I've found is I've done a number of things. One is it focus on developing their right hand reading by giving them the tuned percussion part. The other is to get focus on their bass clef reading. If you're missing that bass line, the bassoons, the tubas, that works perfectly well. It also encourages them to really listen, to count, and just to focus on developing reading one hand, particularly if they're at that sort of beginner intermediate stage of playing piano. If you find that your students are becoming more advanced, then at that point you could put the 2 parts together so they're playing 2 hands. What do you do with your acoustic guitarists? Again, in the same position like your piano students. So for tip 8, really look at how you can bring them into your ensemble so that they have a place to play and develop ensemble skills. If your guitar students are learning to read notation, whether it's from tab or actually stave, this is a great way for you to encourage their music reading and their listening skills. The biggest challenge you'll find is if you've only got 2 or 3 of them in a large concert band, you will struggle to hear them. So have them right at the front of your rehearsal and at a concert at the front when they're performing, so at least they can be seen and heard to a certain extent. Over the years, I have given those guitar parts the oboe part, the simplified flute part, simplified trumpet or clarinet part. Depends on their skill and their ability. If they're really good, then you may well want to harmonise and give them chords and various other more complicated parts, but it will depend on how good they are and whether they're acoustic guitar or playing electric guitar. Some of the flexible music actually really does work for electric guitar, and they can then play, the melodic line of part 1 and feel really confident because you'll be able to hear them. So again, with your guitars, you've got to think about acoustic different to electric guitar and the sort of ability range of reading and where they're up to in their musicality. If they're a student that has learnt tab, again, Sibelius is a brilliant way of doing this really quickly. So you jump in and you write out the part in notation, and then you can literally transpose that into tab and it'll give all the correct tab notation. I tend to then give that to the students both parts so they can see their part as notation and tab. You find that in the rock school, that they do that in the rock school guitar books, and I think it's really good practice that we do that as teachers, because it does then encourage them to start looking at the rhythm and to start looking at the shape of the melodic line, even if at that point they are still reading the tab notation. For tip 9, don't undervalue your beginner bass guitarist and get them involved if you can, and as quickly as you can. Even if at that point they're still playing very much open strings and a few basic notes, because most of your band music will need some sense of, the chord 1, chord 5 for that progression. And actually having them play those parts will help the overall sound, particularly if you're like, a lot of us have got these unbalanced parts. You might find that you're missing a lot of the bass section. You might not have your tubas, your euphoniums, your trombones. You might not have a bassoon player. So having that, at least some bass part going, is really helpful. Some of my most successful students were double bass players who were also bass guitar players, and they were in the band within 5 or 6 weeks playing very simple parts. But because they were playing and they could understand that their part was so important, that encouraged them to practice, and they went on to be really amazing players. So don't underestimate even putting your beginner in. Think of them as helping out like the timps and helping out that sort of harmonic structure of your piece. However much we'd all love to run a band where we have all the parts covered, where we have the bassoons and the French horns and there's a full trombone section and the oboe, sometimes we just don't have that. However much we encourage students to learn those instruments and put that support package in within our school systems. So ensuring we can include students into our band is really important, and the joy that they get is actually sometimes much more rewarding than just trying to keep a total balance of correct music literature. I've had amazing bands where I've had violins in there and guitars in there and cellos playing with the concert band, and the success that they have had, particularly when we were in a school where there wasn't many students in the building, there wasn't many students being able to afford to have lessons. This was a way of helping them, the students, be encouraged to continue to play their instrument and find success, and more importantly, make friends. That lifelong friendship should never be undervalued. That's a gift our department gives our students in perhaps a way that other subjects don't. So tip 10 is really how you can support your students being successful in whatever ensemble. Don't be afraid to send backing tracks to students by email, whether it's to their parents, or if you're in sort of primary, elementary, or if you're in senior, send it directly to them through the school email system. Send them the backing track of the piece so they can hear that. JW Pepper and all of these resources now, put them on YouTube. There's other people who've recorded and put the music on YouTube. Find a really good performance and send it to the students so they can play along. That is really important, particularly if they're playing, a guitar part or a violin part, so they can really hear how their part blends in. Make sure you give them practice copies. I always had a sign-up sheet in my room. They could have a practice copy, so they could take it to their instrumental teacher or go home and practice those tricky passages in isolation, away from the rest of the band. So it actually means your band go quicker because they're practicing more. We even got to a point where we were, practicing and saying, do you want it scanned as an email, so they could have it as a scanned copy rather than a photocopied, so it cuts down the amount of admin that you do. And if you are lucky enough to have instrumental teachers on site, give them a copy of the music that you're working on so they can help their students in their lesson, even if they only spend 5 minutes on a certain section from the band piece. And if you don't have instrumental teachers on site, then try to build up a relationship with the instrumental teachers out in the community so that you can send them practice copies, or at least tell them what the pieces their students are working on, and if they have a spare 5 minutes in a lesson, can they help go over any difficult challenges, or bowing, positioning, anything that's technically going to support that student on a specific instrument. Any way they can get some extra help is going to be a bonus to your program. So I'd love to know what your best tip is for helping develop those unbalanced bands where you're including, the instruments that maybe might not be traditional in a concert band, so that those students can achieve. Love you to leave that in the comments below. This is a music community. We are here to share our passion for music, help each other. If you like this video, please share and subscribe to the channel, share it with colleagues, and I look forward to seeing you again here very soon on Passionate About Music Education.